Thanks, guys. It's very good to be here. Very good to see Barney and Rhonda again after much too many years. He was like a gazelle, actually. He he was a very, very smooth mover. Even though he was like 10 years older than all the rest of us, he was quicker than us, and he just glided along. He was an integral part of the undefeated team. Great to be here. He was also a senior student. I don't know whether he's ever told you that. He was destined for leadership. I'm sure he's doing a great job here. And I love the flags. When the invitation to come and speak here came into the Centre for Public Christianity, one of the people who got the call said, I want you to say yes, because I talked to Peter and he seems like a really nice guy. And I showed a picture of the flags and I thought, I'm in. It's brilliant, it's a great idea, and I love a church that's mission conscious. I don't have very long. I can't really explain Islam in 15 minutes. But what I'm going to try and do is, and it might be a little strange, I'm going to try and use a little bit of the Bible to give you a very, very quick oversight about the key things about Islam, and hopefully along the way give you a little bit of a Christian way of thinking about it as well. If you've got a Bible there, I'm just going to look at a couple of verses in Romans chapter 10. But I'll start with a story. It's a story about when I was invited along to a Muslim outreach evening in Melbourne. It was in a place called Broadmeadows. Don't know if you know Melbourne, northern suburbs. A bit like being invited to Rooty Hill or to Mount Druitt. It's a dodgy part of town, and this particular suburb had a very heavy Muslim population, majority Muslim. There was a meeting there in the town hall. I worked with Somalis for a long time in Melbourne. That's my sort of way into understanding Islam. And a Somali friend invited me to an event. They had an American out to speak. It was very much like the sort of event you'd have here. You'd wheel in a speaker and you'd invite your friends so that they could hear about, in that case, Islam. So I went along with my friend. We drove out to Broadmeadows and we parked with all the other V8s out in Broady, and we went into the town hall, Broadmeadows Town Hall. It was probably about this size, except it had another balcony level, so all the women were up there, the men were on the floor. Something like 500, from what I could tell, Muslim men sitting on the floor. And the speaker started speaking, and for about an hour he talked about God. He was trying to prove to us that God was real and that God was the creator, and he was a good creator, and he was a just creator, and he'd made the world beautiful, and he made us to live in the world, and we were to live his way, but ultimately we were going to be judged. I talked for about an hour. After an hour he said, What I want you to do is, I would like you to put your hand up if you are not a Muslim. And so I'm sitting there thinking, well, this isn't really what I was coming along for. I was just interested. But my friend knew I was not a Muslim. So I thought, all right, I'll have to man up. So I stuck up my hand. I'm looking around. 10 hands went up out of the 500. And then the guy said, all right, you can put your hand down if you don't believe in God. So if you believe in God, keep your hand up. And 5 hands went down. He said, right, you 5, I want you to come down the front. And so they set up on the stage 5 chairs, and they put us in the chairs. And so I was the last chair. And then, now he hadn't spoken about Muhammad, but he went to the first guy, said, do you believe that Muhammad's a prophet? And the guy said, yes. Went to the second person, do you believe Muhammad's a prophet? And he said, yes. And the third person said, yes. And the fourth person said, yes. And it came to me. And he asked me whether I thought Muhammad was a prophet. And I was about to be the only person in the room who was going to deny that Muhammad was a prophet. Now, here's one interesting thing. Why, I'm not having a go at you either, but why are we chuckling at that story? And I'm guessing you were feeling what I was feeling there. I was thinking, if I say no, Muhammad's not a prophet, am I going to get out of here? And clearly I did. I said no, and there was just a few murmurs, but then the main speaker said, that's okay, this guy's on a journey to truth, he needs to find it himself. And then they gave me a show bag with Qurans and DVDs and books, and I was surrounded by 12 guys and we were talking. Similar thing that would, well, maybe not putting him up the front, but very similar to what would happen here. And I guess this is the first thing I want to say about Islam, and Muslims in particular. Muslims hate the idea that they've got a bad rap as being crazy people, terrorists, violent people. They actually think, and this is the sort of the behind my book title, The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity, they think that they're the sensible people. They think their beliefs are rational. They think the Christians believe the crazy things like trinities and incarnations. We just believe in the one God, and we believe that he sent a whole string of prophets, and then finally this guy Muhammad turned up, who was the last prophet. We believe in Abraham and Moses and David, and on it goes. They believe in Jesus. But then Muhammad came, and he's the final revelation, and things got a bit mixed up along the way, but Muhammad came to give that final revelation that would seal it all up. But most of all, they're monotheists. It says here in Romans 10, I'm reading from verse 2. This is actually about the Jews. Paul talking about the Jews, but it could just as easily be about Islam, because if you wanted one image, what a conservative Orthodox Muslim is like, they are like a Pharisee in the way they think about God, in the way they do religion. They're very similar to Pharisees. So Romans chapter 10 verse 2 says, I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Muslims are absolutely zealous for God, the keeny-beeny ones. There's a lot that aren't keen, but they are passionately monotheistic. They want to know God. And as it says here too, since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. But they're interested in God's righteousness. They want to be good people. They want to live the way that God wants them to live. They want to be right with God too. They want to know that when they meet God and enter eternity, that they will not go to hell, but that they'll be saved. But it's not based on knowledge. Muhammad's an interesting guy. He had visions, and he plucked together. If you study Islam, you'll see that it's sort of a cobbling together. I wouldn't use that word with a Muslim if I was you, but there's bits of Judaism in it, and there's bits of Christianity, and there's bits of other religions, and he was this guy who wanted people to be passionate about God, and he wanted a book, and so he developed this scripture, and I think he got real visions. I don't think they were from God, but he ended up with this thing where he was passionate about God but didn't know very much about him. So Jesus is in the Quran, and Muslims will talk about that. In fact, the stories about Jesus are more amazing than what it says about Muhammad. But Muslims know almost nothing about Jesus. Even though they say, yeah, we love Jesus, they know very little. We ran a lot of youth programs, and there was a young guy, 18, 20-year-old, and I ran into him outside the gym where we played our indoor soccer, and he had a T-shirt on, and it said on the front, I love Jesus, and on the back it said, because I'm a Muslim, and he was too. Muslims think they love Jesus, they love all the prophets. Anyway, I said to him, Abdi, what do you love about Jesus? Tell me one thing that Jesus said that you love, or something he did that you love. And Abdi said, well, it's just a free T-shirt from the mosque. I don't really know anything about Jesus. But here's the thing, it's not just a free T-shirt from the mosque. No Muslim knows anything much about Jesus because the Quran tells them hardly anything. They all think he's the Messiah. But I guarantee you, if you ask any Muslim what a Messiah is, they have no idea. They're just words. And so much of the Quran is like that. They call God the most gracious, but they don't experience God's grace. The most loving, but they don't know God's love. They're passionate about God, but they don't have a knowledge of God. And because they don't have that personal interaction with God, there's no promise in Islam that you can come close to God. There's no gift of the Holy Spirit. Even in heaven, there's no coming close to God. Because they can't come close to God, because they can't be right with God. Instead, they establish their own righteousness. Like it says in verse 3, they don't know the righteousness with God, so they seek to establish their own. And what that means is, Islam is just a string of rules. Lots and lots and lots of rules about being a good person and they think there's an angel here adding up your good works and another one adding up your bad works, and you just got to do heaps of good stuff so that you can be right before God and hope that He'll be merciful and let you in. Many, many rules. That's what the Sharia is. People talk about Sharia law. It's all God's laws. And the various schools of Muslim thought, they're just different ways of trying to work out how do we follow these laws. Some are really strict, some are less strict. Saudi Arabia, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, very strict end of the law. They're like a strict judge. But there are more gentle judges and more spirit of the law type judges. But it's all about the rules. And Muslims are under this heavy burden. There's no help from God. Here are the rules. You just got to keep them. And they have this burden of trying to be good in their own power. And it's a very heavy burden. Here's an example. We worked with Somalis. Somalis tend to get married when they're about 16 or 17, at least the girls. They have a lot of kids. Less in Australia, only 6 or 7. But what that meant was we knew women who were maybe 29, 30 years old who had 6 kids. Now, here's the thing. In Islam, here's just one little law. In Islam, you're supposed to fast. You fast during Ramadan for a month, from sunup till sundown. One of the key rules. But you don't fast if you're breastfeeding or if you're pregnant. But if you miss the fast, then you have to catch up. We knew women who had been either breastfeeding or pregnant between 16 and 30. And you can do the maths. They had 14 months of fasting to catch up on. More than a year's worth of fasting. And you say to them, surely God, He doesn't want to burden you with something like that. And they said, yeah, we don't like it. But what can we do? God says it. And that is Islam. One last story, and then we can, I'll make one last point, and then we can have some questions. In so many ways, Islam is like a sort of a watered-down version of Christianity. Very similar conceptions of God and about a life of obedience and zeal and all that sort of stuff. But here's the thing. Islam's about being a good person. And people try and be from bad people to good people. Christianity is about being a dead person and then being an alive person. Islam has no sense of that. No sense of God coming powerfully into my life and resurrecting me and changing me from the inside. There was a guy I knew, really nice guy, had a major problem with alcohol. And so he struggled. His kids were lovely too, they were great. So what he would do is, because his family wanted to clean up his life, and so he would become a Muslim, sort of the way he even put it like that. I'm going to be a good Muslim this month. He would stop drinking. After a month, he'd fall back into drinking. And then a month later, he'd become a Muslim again. And then he'd drink again, and a Muslim again. And it was just this cycle. And it was just so sad. He was this guy, desperately wanted to be a good person. But he was bound in sin, and there was no way out of it. God was offering no help, just rules. Muslims are zealous for God, but they don't really know God. And they try and establish their own righteousness, but they can't pull it off because they don't have God making them from a dead person to an alive person. Verse 1 is the key verse for us tonight. Whatever else you learn about Islam tonight and about Muslims, my hope and prayer is that we'll walk out of here with something of Paul's heart for people who are under that sort of bondage. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites, for the Muslims, is that they may be saved. Because I can testify they're so zealous and they so want to know God, and they want to be right with God, but they don't know him. And so they try and impress him. But in verse 4, Christ is the culmination of the law, so there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. The little bit of knowledge they have about Christ, it's like an inoculation. It's enough so that they think they get it, but they don't have any real knowledge. My hope is that we'll walk out of here with a heart that Muslims might know about the righteousness that they can find in Jesus.
Okay. Oscar is the senior pastor of Nairobi Chapel, a church with a heart for the world, is that right? Okay. Richard, it was very interesting listening to you, and probably I thought that was a gentle introduction to Islam. I say gentle because a lot of us probably look at our television and we hear about ISIS and we say, is that Islam? Is that what the Quran says? You got a comment on that?
Is ISIS Islam? Well, certainly ISIS believes that it's Islam and they claim to be Muslim, and so I think it's very unhelpful. We have a media that says they're a death cult. They portray them as crazy people, as disaffected people. People going to join them are maybe they're social outcasts here. Actually, most of the people I know who've been wanting to go and join fighting, whether it's in Afghanistan or the Middle East, are educated and thoughtful and caring people, and almost the nicest Muslims I know. And the reason for that is because ISIS very much believes, like I said before, the Sharia is about rules. They deeply, deeply believe that the rules that God gives are for everybody, and the best life you're going to get is if everyone lives under those rules. Now, some people might not like it, but that's tough. We're going to enforce these rules. They don't see any separation between church and state, between religious and sacred, which means that you can use the police or an army to enforce God's laws if you want. And it's for everyone's sake, and some people might be hurt in the process, but they deeply believe that what they're doing is creating a God-ruled state. And I think in their minds it's legitimate, and it's certainly quite close to traditional Islam. The sort of Islam that was around when Muhammad was around was very much like that.
Some months back here in Sydney on a program, Q&A, would you know?
Right.
There was a discussion, I can't remember what the key topic was, but there was one of the women on the group who was making a comment about Islam and saying it's a peaceful religion. There was a Canadian academic who taught in a Christian university on Islam. His comment was, there are peaceful Muslims, but Islam is not peaceful. How would you respond to that?
I think Islam can be peaceful, and for a lot of history, there are many versions of Islam. There are moderate versions, there are liberal versions that are quite peaceful. But certainly the Islam that was established by Muhammad, the early Islam, it was not peaceful. Once he came to power, like I said before, he used all the tools at his disposal. He used military force wherever necessary. The word Islam, what it means is everyone has to submit. Everyone submits to God. And you can do that willingly or you can do it unwillingly. And so the space there, like I said before, some Muslims are very, very gentle and they'll be very merciful, and some won't. But there's certainly plenty in the Quran that allows you to be violent if you want. So I'd say it doesn't have to be, but it can be peaceful, it can be violent, and it can be legitimately violent.
Okay. We were chatting today earlier, Oscar, you were saying about the protectorate down on the coast. What's the situation as you see Africa as a nation which is perhaps the fastest growing Christian continent in the world. What do you see with Islam?
I think it would be helpful to just project the map of Africa up on the screen so that I can begin to help us understand. We think of Africa as one continent, but it is possible to think of Africa as divided into half. And I've drawn a red line through the map of Africa, and everything, you know, at the top, to the top of that line is Muslim Africa, and has been traditionally for a very, very long time, for centuries. And everything to the south tends to be what was animistic Africa, not Islamic, and has now become Christian. And the line itself is the sort of the merging of the two religions, the Christian side of Africa and the Islamic side of Africa. And all the conflicts you hear of Boko Haram and of Al-Shabaab are happening along that line, as the two religions sort of come together and clash together. And the line cuts through Kenya, but in an interesting way. If you could put up the map of Kenya, of the country I come from, everything that's shaded in the red is part of Islamic Kenya, and everything that is unshaded is Christian Kenya. Now, the thing with Kenya is that the Muslim presence in our country is about 12%. It's actually a very low number. But the reason why they occupy such a big part of the map is that that part of Kenya is arid, desert-like, and that's where they occupy. So the population there is very sparse. It's, there are nomadic tribes up there, and it's very, very thinly populated up there. Kenya, the dense part of Kenya is on this other side of the shaded part. Now, the coastal strip, however, running along the Indian Ocean is all Islamic, and there's a reason for that. During the days of the slave trade, slaves were taken from the coast of Kenya into the northern Arabic countries, Saudi Arabia and such. Slaves from the eastern side of Africa went to Arabia and the Arab nations in the Middle East. Slaves from the western side of Africa came to Europe because it was much nearer, and they went to the Americas and to Brazil and that part of the world. And along the coast, there were trading dhows that would come down from Arabia and go right down the coast of Africa, trading along that route, taking spices where they could, and then collecting slaves and taking them up into Arabia. And one of the key trading points was the island of Zanzibar, which is part of present-day Tanzania. And so it's a little further than this map, further down than this map shows you. And the Sultan of Zanzibar had declared that everything along the coast of Africa coming down past, to the southern tip of Tanzania was all part of his, regional territory, and it was declared Muslim. But the Muslims never actually penetrated into the middle of Africa and deep into Kenya itself. When the British colonized Kenya, this 10-mile strip along the coast did not belong to Kenya. It belonged to the Sultan of Zanzibar. But when Kenya was granted independence by the British, there was a question of Kenya then doesn't have a port, a seaport, yet this is part of the region that the British had used to land their ships at Mombasa and to come into the hinterland. And so they negotiated with the Sultan of Zanzibar that this would be, succeeded off from his sultanate and become a part of Kenya, but that it would always remain Muslim. And the constitution that governs the rest of Kenya doesn't fully apply in this 10-mile strip, because this is ruled by, in some senses, Sharia law, whereas the rest of Kenya is ruled by the constitution that the British put up as they granted Kenya independence. And so whenever you hear of, this conflict between Muslims and, in Kenya with the rest of Kenya, it's in that shaded area. And when you've heard of grenades being lobbed into churches, gunmen, firing, randomly into, church gatherings, it's in that shaded area that is red and that is Islamic, especially because we share a border with Somalia. And Somalia is Islamic and ungoverned and completely unruly, and that's where the Al-Shabaab come from. And so that's what you hear about when you hear about Kenya and extremism.
Have I heard that Islamic money is offering education for people in Kenya, young people, as a draw for them to become Muslim?
It is. Poverty is endemic in Kenya, and so access to medical care is very, very difficult for the majority of Kenyans, access to a good education. And so what has happened is that a lot of money has been flowed into our country from Saudi Arabia and some of the Islamic states like Kuwait and such, and they're building mosques all over the country, even where there are not people to attend the mosques. They nevertheless have the money to put them up and to call an imam to look after the mosque. And he may only have 10 people, but it's still visible, it's still present. And what they do is they often will set up a clinic next to these mosques and offer free medical care for anyone who converts to Islam, and offer free scholarships for anyone who will convert to Islam. And in the midst of poverty and people's desperation, they will convert if that's what it takes, to access those services. And so there's been, they're using, if I may put it this way, evangelistic models that they learn from us. So you even have street preachers on the streets of Nairobi who, will gather a crowd and preach about Islam. Nevertheless, the following is not that big.
Richard, what makes Islam then attractive to people to embrace it, if it is, as you suggest, sort of a moral burden to be a good Muslim?
Right, and I think that question is particularly pressing for me for women. I really can't see what's in it for women, because they carry a lot more of the burdens. That was one example that I told before, but a lot more of the burdens. Well, I think the way I'd answer that is, what is it in Christian communities that makes us tend towards legalism? Why is it so hard to get grace? And again, that's the idea of my book, is that I just think naturally humans like to think that we can pull it off. We don't like to think that we're entirely dependent on God's grace for our salvation or for our resurrection. There's an appeal in being in control ourselves. There's an appeal in thinking that I'm not all that bad a bloke or girl. And I think as well, there are only two significant groups of Australian people becoming Muslims. Like when I say statistically significant, enough that you notice. One is women who marry Muslim men. It's hard to know how genuine that is. I've met some who were genuine, a lot who weren't. They just went through the rituals. But the other significant group is Aboriginals, and particularly Aboriginals in jail. And I think the other part of the appeal, apart from it appeals to our sense of self-righteousness, it appeals to power. It's the idea that you can change the world politically and you can use force, and we like that. And so Aboriginals are embracing it partly because it's not the white man's religion, but partly too, in the same way that you had the black Muslims in America, Nation of Islam, you can wrap up your religion with your politics and you can become a powerful person. There are at least two of the things that appeal about it. And then there's the rationality. There's the sense that Christians believe stupid things, Muslims believe sensible things, and that are easy to understand. And it's very practical, and it is very easy to understand.
I have heard Australians say that it's difficult to be positive towards Muslims because of their appearance, their apparent unfriendliness, and what appears to be a sort of a separatist behaviour, not wanting to join with the community, and because they, someone said, seem intent on upsetting the world and have a particular animosity towards Christians. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, well, there are some separatist Muslim communities in Australia. Somalis would be one. Some Somalis are not at all interested in becoming very Australian. But here's a suggestion. Next time you see a Muslim in the street, smile at them. If you're a guy, don't smile at the girls. That might get a bit messy. But particularly if you're a woman and you see a Muslim woman, smile at them and just see what happens. Because I think the statistics tell, and certainly my experience of living within a Muslim community, nearly every woman who is identifiably Muslim has suffered abuse on the street, and at a whole variety of different levels. A friend of mine in Brisbane, he was walking past a park and he saw some Rohingyan, who are like Burmese Muslims, playing soccer, and he thought, I'm going to go and say hello to these guys. And he ended up inviting them back to his house. And they were refugees. They'd been in Australia 5 or 6 years, and they said, this is the first Australian home we've ever been in. And he was Irish, he wasn't even Australian. But this is you're the first person who's actually talked to us and welcomed us in. And so I think, yeah, some are separatist, but most of them are shy and feeling like they're being treated as that everyone looks at them and sees a terrorist. And so they're scared. So yeah, particularly as Christians, heck, we're supposed to love our enemies, let alone people who are not our enemies. And the number of people who actually buy into an Islamist agenda worldwide, and including Australia, it's like 10, 15%. 85% of the Muslims that you run into, they just want to get a job, and they want their kids to stay out of drugs, and they want their marriages to work, and they want to live their life. They don't know very much about Islam. And so some, yes, most, please welcome them, be friendly with them, and they'll be incredibly warm. And if you join in with their picnic, you'll be very full very soon, and it'll be great food usually.
You've given significant attention to the differences in understanding when Muslims speak about Allah, and Christians speak about God in the place of the Lord Jesus in those two religions. How would you express the difference, and how would you advise Christians here in Australia to approach issues like that?
The difference between Allah and the God of the Bible. If you're talking with a Muslim, and this is partly the story I told before about Broadmeadows. If you talk with a Muslim, they will think that they are talking about, that Christians and Muslims are talking about the same God. And in a general sense, we are talking about the same God. God's the creator. He's good. He's powerful. He's a just judge. But the big difference is in the way that you see humans interacting with God in Islam and humans interacting with God in Christianity. And it's very, very common. You'll hear this a lot. But Islam has 99 names for God, and that's true. And Christians would be able to tick off most of those names. He's powerful, he's loving, he's forgiving, blah, 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 blah. But the one name they don't have is Father. And that's because in Islam, God is not personal. You don't come close. In Christianity, we come close. Here's a little illustration. Hands up if you met the Queen. One person. Sorry? Oh, excellent. Yeah, archbishops don't count. Actually, no, that fits the illustration really well. The only people that get to meet the Queen are very highly diplomatic, significant figures in the community. Most people would have no chance of meeting the Queen. And how do we relate to the Queen? Well, we're the subjects, and what the subjects do. How do you be a good subject? You obey the laws. You can sing the song, God Save the Queen, and probably the Queen would prefer it if you sung that with enthusiasm, but you don't even really need to do that. As long as you just do what you're supposed to, you're a good subject. And you don't expect to come close to the Queen. You don't expect, unless you've got a special way in, you don't expect you just knock on the door at Buckingham Palace and say, "Hi, Queenie, I'm here, really love to have a chat." The Queen may be loving and gracious, and one of my friends knows the Queen well. Her father was one of the Queen's chaplains, and apparently the Queen is really loving and gracious, but it makes no difference to me because I can't come close. I have no personal relationship with the Queen, never expect to. That's Islam. Whatever God's like, it's a bit irrelevant. One of their most famous theologians said, God's unknowable. You can never come close. The difference with a Christian God is we can run into the throne room and we can sit on his knee and we can pray to him, expecting he'll answer our prayers because he is our Lord, he is our King, but we're princes and princesses and we can come close because we call him Father. That's the biggest difference, is that personal interaction that we can have as Christians.
Oscar, you have a heart for the world and you're involved in a movement to plant churches in various parts of the world. You might want to just move a little bit further away from encountering Islam, but what are whether it's Islam or other faiths, what do you find as you seek to plant churches in areas where the predominant worldview is not Christian? Can you make a comment on that?
From my perspective, I think my paradigm is that there is a battle, and it's a battle in the spiritual realm first and foremost. And one of the things that does us no service, doesn't help us in the mission that God has given us, is this sense of Christian triumphalism and the idea of Christendom. The Bible never promises that, except after the Lord Jesus Christ comes back and the earth will be filled with his glory. Before then, there is a wide road and many travel along that road, and there is a narrow road and not many travel along that road. And that will be, even in the best of circumstances, this is the reality of the world that does not want to know God and instead has chosen to believe what it will believe. And whether that is seen in, Islam, which is, one expression of that, or it is seen in secular Europe, or it is seen in extremist, Hinduism in parts of Asia, this is the reality of our world. And there's a clash of culture, there's a clash of belief, and there is a spiritual battle for the souls and the hearts of men and women. And so going into any context, my expectation is that there will be a battle and there will be a price. You do not go into a battle without expecting that there's a price to pay. And part of that price may be the ridicule and scorn and shame and being belittled and looked upon as, whether we are in a so-called Christian nation that does not really follow the scriptures that we believe in, or we are in a Hindu nation that does not know and worship the God that we worship. My expectation is that there's a battle, and it's a reality of our faith.
I don't know that we Australian Christians necessarily feel too much of the battle. It's fairly easy for us right here.
But it's changing. I think if I could sort of caricature the world and the regions of the world, I think our faith now is coming across extremist Islam, but we're also coming across Hindu extremism. I think we're also coming across atheistic extremism, whether it's in places like China, or increasingly secular extremism, or even maybe atheistic extremism in much of the Western Hemisphere. I think there's a battle that's beginning to take shape in the West, in Europe, certainly in America, that is an ideological battle, and I think you will see more and more and more of it even here in Australia.
Okay. Given the negative picture I started off with, is it easy or hard for Muslims to be Muslims in Australia?
It's hard for Muslims to be Muslims in Australia. Like I said before, there are hardly any Australians becoming Muslim. So what that usually means is you're part of some sort of ethnic or refugee community. And what it means is you live in these two worlds where you're trying, within your community, those communities are holding you very tightly. There's a lot of peer group pressure to remain Muslim, to remain culturally like that community. Then they have to live in the world, and they're trying to negotiate those two things. And again, there's a perception that Australia doesn't want to have them. And you see refugee debates or immigration debates on TV, and again, we don't want to have you. So they find it very, very difficult. And then they see something happening in the Middle East. You might be a gentle, liberal Indonesian Muslim, and suddenly you have to defend what's happening in Syria as if somehow it's got anything to do with you. And so they feel that pressure all the time. Why aren't you fixing that up? Well, I don't believe in it. I know nothing about it. So it's very difficult to be a Muslim in Australia.
So how can Christians best love, as we're supposed to do, Muslims and reach out to them?
Well, again, it's really complicated. Start smiling at Muslims. That'd be a great start. So just say hello, welcome. Again, whatever a Muslim's ideology, political ideology or their theology, our call is to love Muslims and build relationships with Muslims and to care for Muslims. It's very hard to do that if you're scared of someone, but I promise you, the reality is you don't need to be scared of any Muslims. In fact, some of the Muslims are in jail now for staking out Holsworthy Army Base. I know that. I played soccer with those guys. I promise you, they're not baddies. They're just ordinary people who are caught up in this religious motivation that's a twisted one. But they're just ordinary people. So Muslims are people, and we need to love them like people. And they're really easy to talk to, and they're incredibly easy to talk to about God. They're far more keen to talk about God than you are to talk about God, usually, in the West. They're not at all embarrassed about it. The conversation can get tricky quickly, but they'll absolutely be more than happy to hear about your faith, particularly your testimony. Steer away from theological arguments with Muslims unless you really know your stuff. But you can testify and you can ask them personal questions about their faith. What do they pray about? You can share what you pray about. What are they scared about? What are their hopes and dreams when it comes to faith? You can share yours. Very easy to talk to Muslims.
Okay. Have you in Kenya had much exposure to Muslims as far as your church is concerned?
Not directly, because in many of the areas where we are trying to establish churches and many of the communities within, the cities where we're in, Kenya is 80% Christian, and by that, the large bulk of that is nominal. And so they have a knowledge of the scriptures, they have a knowledge of Christ, they have heard the stories, they go to church, and the reality is 8 out of 10 Kenyans that you're going to meet are going to be from some sort of Christian background. Only 1 out of 10 is going to be from an Islamic background. And so there's not much direct contact within Kenya.
What, from your perspective, accounts for the dramatic move towards Christianity that's taking place in the continent of Africa? It is the fastest growing Christian continent, isn't it?
Yes, it is. A lot of it is, I would say, 2 things. One is you need to realize that it is sub-Saharan Africa that has made this massive move towards Christianity. Everything under that red line has made a massive move towards Christianity. And the reason is because many of the religions of sub-Saharan Africa were animistic religions. We believed in the spirits of the mountains and the spirits of the hills and the spirits of the waters and the spirits of the trees and the forests and those sorts of things. And this was not a codified, well-reasoned, historical religion. Many of these were tribal gods that were held sway only in a small territory. And depending on where you were, the gods were different and what was believed in was different. Unlike Islam, or unlike Buddhism, or unlike Hinduism that has been there for centuries, it's codified, it's been written down, and they have scriptures, and people have practiced this religion for aeons. Not so in much of sub-Saharan Africa. These were tribal gods. And so when Christianity started to spread into Africa, many of these animistic beliefs did not stand up to the reasoned, well thought through, written religion that was coming to take this part of Africa. And so many of those animistic beliefs have been swept aside by the testimony of Christianity. And that's where the spread has been widest. Towards North Africa, it's been a much, much slower work. But much of North Africa is desert, and the populations are very sparse. Having said that, however, I think for quite a while now it's been known that there is actually almost a revival taking place in several countries within the Middle East and Africa, in North Africa. And one of those is Algeria. There's a lot of conversion taking place to Christianity in Algeria.
Is that amongst the Berbers?
Yes, and the very interesting thing about that is that much of it has not come out of a consistent Christian witness, as you see in the rest of Africa. It has come out of visions and dreams that individuals have, and many are Muslims who have come to faith that will tell you that I saw a white light and there was a man in that light, and he told me to go and read about Jesus. And it's a very different way of conversion, and yet there's a revival taking place there. The other, I've heard it said that in Iran and in Afghanistan, there's a lot of conversion taking place. In fact, Afghanistan was, I think 3 years ago, rated as the fastest growing national church in the world because of the number of conversions that were taking place, and it's all about dreams.
Well, we could go on for quite a while, but Peter, I think you wanted to open this up to questions from the floor.
Yes.
I will, before we conclude, ask both our speakers if they'd like to make a comment to us about Islam and our relationship to it and all that. Peter, we will begin.
So, any questions?
Yeah, this question is to Richard, and I'm really glad you've addressed power, because I had a hang up with that word, because of the God of Christians, not the God of Islam. But 2 other words I'd like you to speak to that come out of the Quran, and one is angel, or gospel, and the other one's Isa, or Jesus. Would you like to develop what the words are saying?
Well, Isa is the Muslim name for Jesus, and Injil is the Muslim name for the gospel. One of the interesting things about that is that Isa is not the Arabic word for Jesus, the Arabic for Jesus is Yeshua or Joshua, not Isa. Again, Muhammad didn't really know very much about Christianity, and he'd heard stories, and there was heretical Christians around, so he took the name Isa. The question about terminology is an interesting one. Should you use Allah when you're talking about God with a Muslim? Should you use Isa? If you do use words like that, you need to realize that you're using Muslim words at that point and not Arabic words, and a Muslim might just as easily think, oh wow, you're calling Jesus Isa, you're becoming a Muslim. Or because in Islam it's about practice more than it really is about beliefs. You need to believe that God is one and Muhammad is prophet. But then after that, it's very much you take on board and you live out your Islam. So you need to be careful about using Muslim terminology, I think. I don't use the word Isa. I would use the word angel, because I don't think it's loaded in the same way. And Allah is Arabic, so it's okay to use the word Allah, I think. And a lot of Christian Arabs will use that word.
Thanks, Richard. Al.
Richard, could you speak about the 5 pillars of Islam that we hear about?
5 pillars?
Yeah.
Right, again, Islam is, and this is a helpful distinction, Christianity is, we talk about orthodoxy, the way we decide whether we're in or out is we believe this set of beliefs. And we have things like creeds, and so we believe this, we believe this, we believe this. I don't know what ortho means, but doxy means, maybe it's the same, doxy means belief. Islam is really about orthopraxy. It's about, these are the practices that you need to do. And the 5 pillars are basically the 5 most core practices of a Muslim. And the first one is the Shahada, making a confession. I testify that God's one and Muhammad is prophet. The second one, I might get the order wrong, but the second one is you're supposed to say your prayers 5 times a day. You're supposed to give. It's called zakat. It's give offerings. It's 2.5%. It's not like church where you give to the building project or you give to pay for the fantastic rector or anything like that. It's about giving to the poor. It's purely about giving to the poor. Ramadan, you're supposed to fast once a year for a month. And the other one is Hajj, which is the idea you're supposed to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in your lifetime, if you can afford it, and if you're healthy enough to be able to do that. Some people would include jihad as a 6th pillar. By that, they don't just mean the personal. People define jihad as a personal struggle to be a good Muslim, and the word does mean that too. But by jihad, if they're adding that in, they mean you have to strive for the success of Islam as a religion through outreach, through fighting if necessary. So they're the pillars of Islam. They're the practices that every Muslim should involve themselves in regularly. They're the key ones. There are other ones too, but they're the core ones.
Richard, a couple of months ago we had a speaker, Daniel Shasta, and a couple of things I got out when I read his book, or books, were, and also what he said was, if you going to talk to a Muslim, talk one-on-one, not
Right.
have someone else, because they obligate to back each other up in what they believe, whether they believe it or not. I was wondering whether that's your experience. But and another thing was when I read the book, one of his books, that said, as a Muslim, you can lie if it will progress Islam. Doesn't matter whether it's truth. And he quoted when he was in Iran about the Ayatollah Khomeini, I think it is, and how what he promised and what he actually delivered after he got in power. And he also said the true Muslim is a radical Muslim. I was wondering if those 3 things are your experience, the people that you've met, and especially with the radical Muslim, are they like, if they're not a radical Muslim, are they like a lukewarm Christian?
Far be it from me to disagree with Daniel Shasta. He's a great guy. Look, in a general sense, yes. I think all those things are true, but they're not true in a wooden sort of way. Like you need to have a little more, not you, but you need to. Islam is wrapped up in culture. And shame and honour is one of the huge things about Muslim culture, because it was one of the huge things about 7th century Arab culture, which is where Islam developed. And so the idea of taqiyya, that's the not needing to tell the truth. It doesn't necessarily mean a sneaky thing where you're deliberately lying or tricking people. Some Muslims will do that. But in a shame honour culture, nothing is as it seems. And it's your first point as well about don't expect a Muslim to tell you to bear themselves in front of you. They won't confess doubts in front of another Muslim. They won't criticize Islam in front of a Muslim. And if you can make them look bad in front of another person, that'll be really terrible, because in shame honor cultures, the individual is not the most important. The most important is your tribe or your community. I'll give one little story. Like I said, we played sport with young people, and there was one time where just this young guy, a 16, 17-year-old kid, he lied to me, because they do it all the time. Certainly Somalis particularly. Anyway, so I lost my temper this time. I said to him, didn't yell at him, but I just said, Mahmoud, that is why I would never become Muslim, because you keep on lying to me. Now, that was in front of a group of these young guys. And the interesting thing was the reaction of the group. No one got angry at me. They all got angry at him, and they all started yelling at him because he had brought Islam into disrepute. And I felt terrible. My ministry in Melbourne was a string of how not to do evangelism. You just learn through all these really bad things. So don't ever make a Muslim look bad in front of other Muslims. He was already one of the outer sort of guys, and I felt really bad for him. But again, there's that shame honor thing. You don't bring shame on Islam. It's not about lying necessarily. It's just about you have to have the honour of Islam held up. And so that's sort of floating around in that. You need to really get a sense of how shame honour works. Read Sermon on the Mount. That will help you understand how all that stuff works. It's the whitewashed tomb stuff. What's on the outside different to what's on the inside. But yeah, all those things are true. And just on the radical Muslims, the true Muslims, certainly the vast majority of Muslims I've met are lukewarm Muslims. We met one of the Somali women. She was lamenting she couldn't find a husband because she couldn't find any Muslim that prayed 5 times a day. So I think that's largely correct. Very few Muslims take their faith very seriously. And very few Muslims know very much about Islam. Their theological education finishes when they're about 12. And if you went home tonight and Googled Muslim theology, great Muslim thinkers, whatever, after a couple of hours you would know more about the theology of Islam than pretty much any Muslim you run into, unless they're in an Islamic centre or at university. They'll know a whole lot about the practice of Islam and the folk Islam that's passed down and lots of sayings and those sort of things, but in terms of the theological understanding, they're very ignorant generally. And you're right, when they find out about what Muhammad really did, then you can radicalise Muslims when they start reading the Quran, when they start reading the practices of Muhammad back then. So yes, yes and yes. Even though it was a long answer, sorry.
Phil? This is not really meant to sound ironic, but can you be Muslim and Christian at the same time? Meaning, if you're talking about the difference between belief and practice, how much would a Muslim have to change when they became Christian? How much are they saying?
Yeah. That's a matter of huge debate in mission circles about what you ask people to, what you expect of a Muslim in terms of their self-identity. Can a Muslim perceive themselves as Muslim and yet believe in Christ? And obviously the answer is yes. There are many people who will call themselves a Muslim but who believe in Jesus because they can't even conceive of not being a Muslim, because if you are a Somali, you are a Muslim. Like, you can't stop being a Somali, so you can't stop being a Muslim. So I think that's true. But I think the tricky thing in missions with Muslims is how then do they identify when it comes to you? So how do they perceive Christians? Are they your brothers and sisters or not? Or what about baptism? In what sense is baptism a change of identity? But it's tricky for Muslims to negotiate that, particularly when they're still in a Muslim context where if you say, I'm not a Muslim, that won't be read religiously, it'll be read as a betrayal of your culture and you'll be killed. So Muslims have to negotiate that themselves, and I think over time most of them will turn away from calling themselves a Muslim, but it might take a while. That's my experience anyway.
Thanks, Richard. Albert, you have a question?
Richard, you mentioned Paul's struggle there in Romans 10, and he comes to a point there where he recognises then that the true Israel are really those who have a faith like Abraham, which he had before he was circumcised. So it's those
Right.
like Abraham. We have in common with the Muslims that the patriarchal tradition of our faith. I take it that Abraham is very important in the Muslim tradition. He's the father of Isaac and then
Ishmael.
Ishmael, that's it. And so, isn't there an area there where we can explore the nature of God's grace as it applied to Abraham? And how the promises came following Abraham's faith in God, and it was not a sign of his, his works, but his faith.
Right. Right. And here's another, I don't know whether it's contentious, another thing in mission circles, the idea of how much do you play off the idea that Islam and Christianity and Judaism, for that matter, are Abrahamic faiths. And Muslims make a lot out of it because, particularly early on there, Muhammad was looking for legitimacy. He was trying to say, hey, I stand in the line of these other prophets, and the Arabs are Ishmaelites, they're descendants of Ishmael, and they may well be. There's every chance they were. They're all related. They're all Semitic. They're all cousins. It's certainly a helpful way of being able to speak to Muslims because they have this sort of perception that, hey, we're cousins at least and we're in the same boat, and that's a great in because you can start there. But also it's a great in because, as you say, you can even use that story and say, yeah, we are, and that descendants thing it's important, but in the Bible, it was never about the descendant, and that's what Jesus said. You can go to the Jesus stuff about Abraham, saying it was always through faith. It was never just through that identity stuff. And there's even the upside downness of it, which cuts across Islam, which is very Arabic. But the younger son, the unexpected people, it was the baddies. The line went through the baddies, not the goodies. It's all about grace. And it is faith, but it's faith in grace, not faith in... Because Islam believes in faith, Iman. They have a strong sense of faith, but it's faith in grace, not faith in rules or identity. But yeah, lots of helpful ideas that you can talk to Muslims about. Again, don't expect them to know very much about the theology, though.
Okay, one last question. I mean, we could be here all night, I'm sure, and it's a lot of us, I think, are finding it quite fascinating, but we need to wind up. So, Sean, you're last.
That's good. Oscar, this is a question for you. Richard, you've been talking heaps about like how we should be loving Muslims, and it seems relatively easy in Australia because a lot of radical sort of stuff we see on TV. But Oscar, I was wondering, how do you see your church kind of living that right now, or go about doing it? Because I imagine it'd be a very different sort of experience and a different mindset and be more encouraging our hearts to overcome to do that. You guys, can you hear your thoughts on that?
Well, probably very quickly, and it's to see that the hard answer is, I think the Bible is pretty clear how we're to treat Muslims, and it is that, as Richard said, love your enemy and learn to turn the other cheek. I know that along that line of the clash of Islam with Christianity, the big question has been, when you're attacked and shot and grenades are thrown into churches, how do you respond? Should Christians pick up guns and protect themselves? Should we retaliate and attack the Muslims? Or should we turn the other cheek? Now, of course, you know, there's what the state must do in terms of ensuring security and those sorts of things. But how do we as Christians respond to that? And I think you find two reactions, especially if you look at Nigeria, where this conflict has been a lot more intense than it is even in Kenya. And the first is, the church has been driven to extremes where it will pick up guns and attack Muslims to try and defend, Christians. But there are those who call and advocate that, the weapon God has given us is to love back in return and to turn the other cheek. And there's a very high price to pay for that. But that is what differentiates us in our response, that we do not hit back and that we do not kill and maim because that was done to us, but that instead we try and love. And I actually believe, maybe a little like Richard says, that the battle will never be won for the hearts of Muslims by arguments, by theological debates. If anything, it will be won by love and reaching out. And maybe I could just very quickly, Richard, share my own little story. I was a student in India for my undergraduate degree. I studied at the University of Delhi and did a degree in zoology. I went to India innocently. I did not know about racism. I had grown up in Kenya, post-colonial days, and so I had little interaction with the British government or whatever, and the colonial powers. I did not know about racism. I found racism when I went to India. And within the Indian polytheistic, pantheon of gods, they believe, in their caste system that the Harijans or the untouchables are the lowest caste. You don't even touch them, which is why they're called the untouchables, okay? But Africans don't even have a spirit. And so they're much lower than the Harijans. And therefore, I would enter a bus and sit on a seat on a bus that was jam-packed and be the only one sitting on that seat. Nobody will sit next to me because they don't want to have anything to do with Africans. I'd have people calling me names as I walked up and down the street, went into the market. It was very, very difficult as an African student in India. My response before accepting Christ was to hit back and sometimes get into fights, to call them names, and to respond and retaliate in my own way as an attempt to sort of make them regret that they had treated me this way when I encountered this sort of racism. But after I accepted Christ, it took me about a year to come to the position where I could accept that when Jesus died for my sins, he also died for the Hindus, and that he loves them just as much as he loves me, and that I cannot continue to retaliate the way I've always done. I must learn to love them, and it is not for them to love me, but for me who knows Christ to love them back in return. It was very, very difficult. I think that's what we've got to learn to do with Muslims. And in India, when I did come across an Indian family that would reach out to me in love, it spoke volumes. It won my heart over, that they would be so gracious as to invite me into their home, to cook for me, and to just love on me. And we may not be able to win the battle of debates and, philosophical arguments, but nobody responds in words of love. Love towards their children, love towards their women folk, which for the women here means a lot, that we reach out to a Muslim woman, but even love towards the men folk in simple ways as developing friendships. So they come into this country as migrants. The desire of a migrant above all things is to be received and accepted, to be given a foothold in which to begin to put their life together, because they're running away from, for many of them, economic hardship or even dangerous situations, and they long to find a place where they can live at peace, and to have somebody indigenous to that context reach out to them in love and draw them into friendship is very powerful. You have won half the battle just by reaching out in love. And they will listen, they will befriend, they will treasure that relationship because love has been directed towards them. I think that's how the battle is won. And therefore we must learn to to turn the other cheek and, in our context, even with extremism, to love them back in return as best as we can.
Thank you. If you'd like to let that to stand as your closing statement, then would you like to close, Richard, with a comment?
Sure. Well, apart from amen to that one. Maybe I'll tell one story that illustrates that. I teach on missions, and people have done a bit of research. Here's the interesting thing. You meet Christians who were Muslims. They might have some baggage, but you wouldn't be able to tell they were Muslims generally. They're just Christians. And the reasons they became Christian are the same reasons that you become Christian or became Christian or stay Christian. They nearly all testify to encountering Jesus. Sometimes it's a vision, but usually it's through the Bible. And overwhelmingly, they testify to Christians loving them. And let me just give you one little story. One of my good friends, this is how he became a Christian. And hopefully this will be an encouragement to you in ministering to Muslims, that it really ain't very hard. He was seriously a Muslim. He's Palestinian. He was in the Muslim Brotherhood when he was young. His father got him put in jail as a teenager for a weekend to try and shake that out of him. But eventually he got shaken out of him because he was angry about the injustices that his people suffered. He was angry at the Muslim countries around him for not helping. He was angry at the West. He was an angry guy. But he also worked out that terrorist organisations did a lot of talking and didn't have many sensible answers because he was a smart guy too. He ended up coming to Australia in his sort of mid-late 20s to study a master's degree at university. He got sick fairly early on in his course and ended up in hospital. And one of his lecturers visited him in hospital. Now, in the Middle East, they would never do that. The lecturer is up here, the student's down here. Lecturers don't lower themselves, certainly not to go to a hospital. And so my friend says to this guy, what are you doing here? And the lecturer, his name's David, he's a Christian guy. He just said, well, I followed, and this is the tricky evangelism bit. You don't need to do a course to say this, I promise you. He said, well, I followed Jesus, and he went and he sort of calls to look after sick people and visit them and care for them. That was it. That was his gospel. And my friend Mustafa is his name. He said, that's it. That's the sort of thing I've been looking for years, for people to care about someone that's not them. And so as soon as he got out of hospital, he Googled, find out about Jesus. And the second thing that came up was the Baptist Bible College. He quit his master's was a medical degree, and he quit that, enrolled in the Baptist Bible College. Don't know how they let him in, but anyway, he was still a Muslim. He became a Christian after a month or two of studying the scriptures in the Bible College. Wasn't a great theological argument, wasn't even a great gospel presentation, but it was loving and it was pointing to Christ and saying, and Jesus said, it's by your love that people will know that he's real. And it's true for Muslims too. They're not too hard, they're not too scary. Even Muslim Brotherhood terrorist guys can come to faith.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Oscar. Let me just encourage you again to look at Richard's book, The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity. You'll find 9 very interesting chapters on a range of subjects which, as Peter said, will not only give you insights into Islam, but will stir again your thinking about your own faith. And if you don't want to tackle that, there's a second book that he's written, Witnessing to Western Muslims. It's smaller, you can read that first and that one afterwards. So let me commend those two. Let me thank Oscar. We've valued his ministry already, and we've appreciated, brother, what you've had to say for us tonight. And thank you, Richard, very much.
Thanks, Harry.
It's in your court.
Thank